Hello, and thank you very much indeed for asking me to come and talk to this this meeting of the of Find Courses, your expo. I hope it's going well. You're enjoying yourselves and seeing lots of interesting things. My name's David Freedman from Huthwaite International. Huthwaite International has been helping people become more effective at selling and negotiating for almost 50 years. And I'm conscious that there are a lot of seminars about this subject of selling, for want of a better word, virtually or remotely or digitally or any of the other words that people are using at the moment. But I think with reference to some of the long-term behavioral research we've done over the years, we might be able to offer you a few new insights. So sit back and I hope you enjoy it for the next half an hour or so. I suppose what I want to try and do is just to talk about, for want of a better word, the current crisis. It's now been more than a crisis, it's probably a way of life, but it's something we're getting used to. And I'll probably try and cover a little bit about this thing we call the buying cycle and how that's changing as a result of having to sell differently. And then some of the eternal verities, if you like, of selling virtually, things we've always known that we didn't need this crisis to help us remember, but it's worth bearing in mind and they may have changed a bit. And then particularly what's happening now in terms of how we use the technology and media like the one I'm on today to be certainly no less effective and arguably more effective. I think this is something, just before we kick off, that probably rings true for everybody in business and in their private life. Sort of meaningless approach to the market that a lot of sales operations employed early on in the crisis, and it exactly runs against the kind of research that the Harvard Business Review did, I think, not long ago, when they said that that when CEOs are in trouble, the thing that helps them most isn't research or published wisdom, it's a phone call from a friend, and that meaningless responses like this are exactly the sort of thing people don't want. They don't just want a bit of guff, they want actually to have some personal contact. The question is, how do they have that personal contact? And I suppose that brings me to the first real point. Just to look back, if we want to try and cover these agenda points, and the first of those is really about this thing we call the buying cycle. There's a picture of it behind me because I've been using this room for doing quite a lot of work with clients over the last few months. Really, before I talk about that, I mean, some of you will be familiar with it. Anyone who's worked with Huthwaite in the past will be familiar with this thing that we call the buying cycle. And I don't have time in this 30-minute session to run through what it means. The words on it, I hope, are to some extent self-explanatory. But I think in normal times, this is what the process looked like. But maybe things are a bit different now. Now more than ever, it's important that people who are worried about their business outlook have an opportunity to share those worries in a structured way with somebody who might be a salesperson, but who can be genuinely, not cynically, a trusted advisor all the way around this buying cycle, rather as the Harvard Business Review was saying. So if you look at changes over time, the stage up here at the top, the COVID-19 outbreak is one of massive externally caused changes that, depending on your customer's sector, could cause an existential threat. Or if, for their example, they're a conference organizer and they haven't got a clever way like Find Courses have of putting it online, or they're an airline, or they run a cinema chain or whatever. But it could be a massive opportunity if you're a testing reagent supplier or you're in video streaming services. That it's probably a great opportunity. I think in the short and medium term, it is going to overshadow most other considerations, and customers might be paralyzed or at least daunted by that prospect. So the question is, how do you deal with that? Because this changes, this whole question about changes over time. Well, people are in changes over time. They understand what's going on is different from anything they went before. But the skilled practitioner, the skilled seller, will avoid jumping in with any ready-made or quickly concocted answers. What you'll try and do instead is to understand, and forensically and as unemotionally as possible, see how clients see the business and the personal dislocation affecting different aspects of their own operations. the same skilled sellers will consider whether any needs start to emerge that you could possibly meet, and possibly do so in innovative ways. So in that recognition of needs phase, a skilled seller will focus their questions on those impacts, all the time thinking about, but not yet describing what the right solution could look like and how they could improve upon it. So, for example, even if you've spent weeks building face mask manufacturing capability, if that's your business, and you think the retail sector and the world in general is crying out for it, it's probably still not best to just feature dump that as an exciting new fact, because you're probably not the only people out there offering it. If you get the conversation with the next piece of the supply chain, explore what the frustrations and difficulties are and what the value you can bring in helping them find a way around those specific difficulties in specific ways that differentiate you, so that you can supply them and they can supply their customers or the public. I think customers and clients might be bringing thoughts that normally crop up in resolution of concerns much further forward now into that evaluation stage. It's about risk. Everything's about risk at the moment. Can I be committing funds to a major investment in a digital transformation at a time when our own income stream is not secure? What's the impact on me personally of choosing the wrong option when I choose a supplier? So the key thing there is to get the buyer to revisit the original benefits and guidelines that made them want to look at you in the first place. But you may find that resolution of concerns phase that typically pops up later on, popping up early. Okay, so now more than ever, buyers will be anxious about the consequences of their actions. Sellers need to uncover, to clarify, to help resolve these anxieties in full cooperation with the buyer. And many will know how to do that very well in a face-to-face world. But what about now in the new remote or virtual interactions? Now, I think it's probably worthwhile just going back a generation, because something that's very much with us is this good old-fashioned telephone. Everyone's used one, everyone uses one a lot. Landlines, mobiles, whatever. But still in many people's hands, the thing they're most comfortable with and spend a lot of their time on. Although I am finding that one of the consequences of the move to things like Teams and Zoom and so on and so forth is the conversations I used to have on the phone I'm now having on Teams and Zoom, rather than just conversations I used to have face to face are happening on Teams and Zoom. Interesting byproduct. We'll move on to things like Teams and Zoom later on, but the telephone is not just about short-term, low to medium value telesales. Our own experience, the professional inside sales operations in all sectors, and with individual salespeople and account managers, is that the medium for it's a good medium for the big business-to-business deals with senior decision makers. I sold a piece of business when I first joined Huthwaite in 2002-3. All the work was being done in Australia. I was here in the UK. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of business. I never met the people I was selling to. I only ever spoke to them by email and by telephone. Never met them, never saw them on a screen, and to this day, I've never met them. So it's worth bearing in mind that the telephone is a good medium, as long as you observe certain key points, certain things you should always do. One is planning, I guess. It can be unpopular. After all, you're only making a phone call. You're just picking up the phone. But it's still important, even though it's something we do every day to friends and relatives, to have a structure to keep you on track. Otherwise, you're wasting time. It's going to alienate precious prospects. You'll be seen as acting unprofessionally. And if you are seen as acting unprofessionally, you feel yourself to be under pressure to find the next word, just as I did a couple of minutes ago, because I couldn't call the word to mind. Bit of planning, important. Think through the structure, think through the purpose, think through the objectives. Think about, for example, how you're going to make strategic use of all the contacts in a particular account or opportunity. You're not going to just jump straight into the person you're most likely to get hold of, although you do want to think of who are you most likely to get hold of in this crisis, because they may not be there as they were before or in the same role as they were before. And then what are your objectives? What's your first objective? Is it to get an appointment, perhaps, to schedule a virtual meeting with an agenda that's agreed, or perhaps to have the call you were thinking of having, but to have it with somebody you've identified as a more a more important or influential person. And the second one is then to try and dig a bit deeper, to establish the names of the people in the organization who might be able to help you get that foothold you need. A model we have called three foci, understand who owns the problem, but also understands who can introduce you to who owns the problem. And then at the top of the hierarchy, actually who can loose some purse strings to buy whatever it is you're trying to sell, and don't go to the top first before you've done your homework with the others. That sort of thing. Who owns the problem? You might be able to establish that map, if you like, in one call, but you won't be able to make the sale happen. You may not even get put through to that person. You'll have to be patient. You'll have to build your case, and with those other people rather than with the end person. But don't rush. Rushing risks losing it, and that desperation might even come across in your voice. And plan your credibility statements. Work out, not your whole sales story and all your features, but just that little thing that might make it interesting, and what we call an initial advantage statement that might make people want to have the call with you. How can you solve a problem that they may have that no one else can solve? Salt that into the conversation, but don't go into a lot of detail of what you've got. Your next stage is to start asking them some questions. It's quite clear that you lay out a plan for how you're going to use their precious time, because they may be preoccupied with helping their 11-year-old do their physics homework. So you need to make sure that you're calling at a convenient time and you let them know how you're going to use that time, and make the call all about them. Ask yourself at the end of that call, who had most of the airtime? If it was you, you've probably not handled it right. It should have been them. And if you're a serious organization offering, transformational products or services, you're probably not going to get that deal done then and there. You have to look for an advance, something that takes it to the next stage, get some commitment of time or resources from them. So there we are. And in that, if you like, is perhaps all you can do just by telephone. In the real world, the next stage would have been a meeting. So in this sense, in this world, the next stage may very well be some kind of virtual meeting. And by that, I mean the tools we've become familiar with in the last few months: Zoom, Google Meet, WebEx, Teams, WhatsApp, maybe, anything where you can see and hear people at the same time and maybe present as I am doing here. Now, in the plain old telephony voice world, you will, of course, have had no visual or non-verbal clues whatsoever to help you. And most of us are used to that because we've been using telephones for years. And that's fine. In a virtual meeting, we have some, because obviously you can see me and I'm waving my hands about a bit, but really, how much use are they? We'll talk about those in a minute, but you're getting less on the phone than if you're in the room with them. You're getting less actually on a virtual call if you're in a room with them. And that's fine as long as we really do concentrate on our verbal behaviors. And that's Huthwaite's main area of research, are verbal rather than our non-verbal behaviors. Much of our research actually into the skills of successful salespeople, whether building value early in the cycle or capturing it in the commitment stages and the negotiation later on, focuses on these verbal behaviors. And so, at a time when the communication relies upon these distant voices, sometimes augmented by live pictures, shrunk to a postage stamp, as I am at the moment, and more people joining the conversation, the postage stamp gets smaller. The focus, therefore, increases on what people are actually saying, how they listen, how they process information communicated in discussion, as that progresses into some kind of persuasive case. The novelty of new technologies can lead to some selling teams becoming very technology-led, shaping their behavior around what the technology allows, rather than because those behaviors are conducive to successful selling. So think about what kind of virtual selling is appropriate for which stage of the buying cycle. When clients are at the beginning of the buying cycle, still in what we call those changes over time, they're probably not yet considering the kind of investment you want them to be talking about. It's probably not a successful strategy immediately to try and get this multi-user Zoom conference with all the stakeholders just because you've learned how to do it. Go first to the person who might be receptive, as we said, then go to the focus of satisfaction, and then go up there to the focus of receptivity. When you do finally establish who the various rungs, the important relevant influences are, the people who own the problems you're trying to solve, then you might find yourself facing this gallery of moving, talking faces. At this point, especially, if you have the daunting feeling that all their skeptical eyes are on you, and it would be dangerously easy then to forget what I earlier called these eternal verities of good selling. Truly successful selling should always be more of a pull than a push. Even in the real world, the unskilled person often spends too much time just listing out the features of their offering rather than asking consultative questions and listening carefully to gain an understanding of the prospective client's problems. And that's a trap that salespeople are even more likely to fall into on these virtual platforms without the same behavioral cues and clues to suggest that someone else wants to speak, for example, or where you as a seller, you're more likely to speak simply to prevent a period of silence on the call. People are on mute sometimes, and cameras are off because you want to optimize bandwidth, and you're speaking into this void, a bit like I am now. That's usually the time when you say something that you regret or the listeners have no real need to hear. You've just said it to fill a void. So be very conscious of not doing that. Verbal behaviors, as I say, are what matters in this strange and unnatural environment. They're what you're going to fall back on. So the first thing I think there is to give the customer or prospect plenty of room to speak so they can fully outline the business problems they're facing. Persuasive selling is really centered on the problems of and the potential solutions for that prospective customer and them alone. That means allowing them to talk until they have given their fullest possible answer to any question. Now, it's easy to do that in person, and it's relatively straightforward on a phone call, but it's much more difficult on this multi-stakeholder virtual meeting. If the connection quality isn't very good, if you've got broadband lag, if the voice is dropping in and out every so often, and it's your responsibility, not theirs, to find a way around this. So traditional selling skills such as listening carefully, asking intelligent questions to uncover client issues are more important than ever in helping to compensate for the decline in the subtlety of the availability of the in-person cues. And there are sensible precautions that a salesperson can take when selling virtually. So just as in an in-person meeting, it wouldn't be good practice to rattle through 40 boring slides with words on without any attempt at real dialogue with the prospective clients. So you should avoid the same thing in the virtual forums. And that's all the more so because while you're focused on droning through those slides, worrying if everyone can see the screen share and setting up the next item, you can't be focused on the people themselves, their reactions, whether they want to ask a question, whether they've left the room, or are scrolling through their emails in another window, or whether they're on the phone. And by the way, keep your slides as simple and as unanimated as possible unless you're running them as a full video in a dedicated video application. PowerPoint slides with lots of builds on in a conferencing application are usually very slow to load, and you're usually way past talking about the slide, the build that's only just loading by the time that the screen gets to it. So keep those to a minimum. Now, voice and data and video over IP has given us the power, if we use it properly, to interact fully and to practice plenty of the behaviors that Huthwaite research shows are used more often by successful communicators than by the average communicator. We call them things like bringing in and testing understanding and summarizing and building. And we need to guard against what we call persistent shutting out, which is shown by our research to be a behavior linked to low success in many contexts. If we use those technologies with care and remain alert, we should be fine. But there are risks. One of those is this thing, the time delay is one. Filling the void, as I've said, is another. Another is simply when I talked about shutting out. That's this whole question about talking across other people. And you're not doing it deliberately to interrupt them. You're doing it because the time lag in the broadband makes you think perhaps they've finished or they haven't started yet and they want to start saying something, but you do instead. So you really need to guard against that kind of thing. If you have, particularly if you're leading the conference, leading the sale from your side, and you have another colleague on the lookout for somebody in the screen who might be itching to ask a question, who wants to build on a proposal, wants to challenge some claim you're making, get them involved. Have another person there on your side. If you're the leader, have another person there specifically, as it were, to control the production of what you're doing rather than having to focus on the content of what you're doing. That's your role. It's a bit like live TV. You can't be a presenter and a producer at the same time. And we do have to stress and recognize the extent to which virtual selling can exacerbate mistakes you commonly make in the real world. If you address just a single person with an off-topic remark during a group discussion, that's very distracting in the real world, and it's really distracting in the virtual one too. all the current technologies allow for bilateral conversations within a wider group discussion in such a way that nobody else notices, chat sidebars, breakout rooms, etc. But is that really a sensible option? Should you really be doing that? Use that facility for quick clarification for the client or to agree some immediate tactical thing with a colleague, but don't put your great strategic considerations or detailed conferring in there, because doing so takes the focus away from the real object of the meeting, and that is the customer group you're trying to talk to as a whole and what they're saying. So a few pitfalls to avoid there, where you move from the real world to the virtual world, or from the telephone to the fully virtual conferencing environment. Do make sure that you think of it almost like a broadcast performance. You need somebody else there to guard you against undue shutting out, undue stepping into the void when you shouldn't, making remarks, as it were, privately that you should be making publicly, and really focusing on what it is you're there for, which is to understand the needs of the customer and to give them the maximum airtime, even if there are some apparently awkward silences on the call. Okay, I think the other thing that's probably just worth saying, maybe in closing here, is that there are some distinct advantages for sellers in the virtual sales paradigm we're now in, and I think we're in it for a while. One of them is that it's probably simpler to convene and at short notice a meeting of the people you actually want to speak to at each stage of the buying cycle, because they'll be busy. They might be covering for colleagues. They might be trying to keep their own show on the road, but they won't have large chunks of their diary given over to travel, which is what gets in the way of most people having meetings. So organizing a series of smaller meetings with the right key players as they move around this buying cycle, and without the impediment of a gatekeeper, it might be easier. Everyone is available through Teams or on a mobile or whatever these days. Secondly, when you're on the call, the documents that you might have used in your preparation and planning can be there with you on your desk or on your tablet device in a way that would be odd if you just brought them out in a real meeting and plonked them on the table. So that's quite helpful. If you're making notes on your CRM, or you want some competitor research, or you want some details of your products and services because you can't keep them all in your head when you're talking, and that's great. You've got them there. They can be helpful in ordering your thoughts and in building your argument. And then thirdly, I think, and this is important, this methodology makes these things much cheaper to attend. You don't need the meeting space, you don't need the entertaining, you don't need the travel, you don't need the hotel, and nor do they. And it's less of an opportunity cost in terms of how much time it takes out. So it makes meetings cheaper for you to attend, and I reckon that cost of sale is going to be a very closely patrolled metric in the harder times we are currently in. So who knows, this might or might not be the final face of sales. But if it is, then I think there are some opportunities there to do things not just differently from the way we did them before, but better. I hope you've enjoyed my remarks here to you today, and that you'll have some questions in the chat room or on our virtual stand during the course of the conference. Many thanks indeed, and thank you for listening.